Hello and welcome to our expert panel. I'm Jade Irwin, a Laboratory Service Manager here at Source BioScience. I just want to take a bit of time for everyone just to sort of introduce themselves and the role that they play.
Hi, my name's Kevin Chittock. I'm the head of Molecular Diagnostics here at Source BioScience, and that's within our precision medicine laboratory.
I'm O.Ellis. I'm the medical director of Source BioScience. I'm a histopathologist, that is a pathologist who looks down the microscope at tissue samples, but I also have expertise in molecular biology and other testing methodologies.
I am Tarek Abdel-Fatah. I am working as a clinical senior research scientist and scientific lead for Nottingham City Hospital.
Brilliant. So this is just a chance for us to discuss some of the questions that you've been submitting. And obviously due to the sheer volume, we've had to sort of condense them down the best we can. So we might get through around 4 or 5 questions. So the most common ones that we've typically seen is about accreditation questions. So we've had one about which accreditation and quality standards do we adhere to in the laboratory and how these are maintained. Would one of you be able to answer that one?
Yeah, I can. So from a clinical perspective, our primary accreditation is ISO 15189, and that's through UCAS. So that's evidenced as well through a published and publicly available accredited scope of work. And like many UK healthcare labs, we transitioned to these standards a few years ago now, and that was from previous accreditation through the CPA. So all of our relevant services and assays are either accredited to these standards or are somewhere within the process of an extension to scope application with UCAS, and that's particularly important for new and emerging services where we need to be dynamic in our response to clinical need. So aside from the healthcare testing, we have further accreditation to good clinical practice, GCP, and that's in line with ICH guidelines, and that's accredited by the MHRA. And that's more relevant to our clinical trial support work we do and regulatory projects and that type of thing. So across those two different stringent sets of quality standards, we have a pretty robust quality system in the lab. In terms of maintaining those standards and that accreditation, as well as external audits, such as surveillance audits by UCAS, we have a pretty comprehensive internal audit schedule, which is maintained by our dedicated QA team, as well as peer-to-peer technical audits within the team and other kind of standards of good laboratory clinical practice. So EQA participation, IQA testing, periodic competency assessment, that type of thing, and that's all really kind of managed by our QA team and an overarching quality management system.
Brilliant. Well covered there. So I'll move swiftly on to the next question then that we've got through. So this one's more of a development and upcoming work. So we've had a number of queries of what we are working on next and what our plans are for precision medicine. This has been made up into 2 parts really, and has focused us on the clinical healthcare perspective, but also from a project and clinical trial support perspective. So I don't know who wants to sort of cover that.
I can start, and you can add in terms of the future developments. One of the issues around precision medicine and provision of all the type of tests we do is that the portfolio is ever increasing. So every year there are new tests. Historically, with NICE guidance and healthcare guidance, each test was focused as an individual test on a particular patient's sample. But what we're finding now is that we're often asked for multiple tests on the same sample. And that needs us to look at newer technologies. With the acquisition of Gene Services, they were experts in sequencing technologies, and we are experts in whole genome sequencing techniques. And so one of the approach is that we're actively looking at, and have been for some time, is to use targeted sequencing, or indeed potentially whole genome sequencing of patients' samples, to provide a very comprehensive portfolio of the abnormalities that are present there. And certainly when we're looking at trying to multiplex, that is looking at multiple different abnormalities in a patient sample, that lends itself to next generation sequencing. I don't know whether Kevin wants to make any comments about that and in looking in the future with NGS.
Yeah, I mean that pretty much covers it, but we are looking at NGS panels on a regular basis, so many different versions of those, but they are, the multiplex nature of them is the benefit, particularly in the diseases where the tissue is limited. So they're very common in lung cancer testing, for example, where you can often have small amounts of tissue or scanty tissue as well, and that's really where they can offer greater benefit, where that tissue is limited. So we are working on those, but not just NGS techniques. We're looking at multiplex assays via qPCR, for example, as well. So there's different routes of doing it. So lots of options.
And one of the areas of clinical need has been emerging over the last 10 years, perhaps, but is becoming higher profile is cancer patients who've had conventional forms of treatment. Their disease has come back, and they've had the second line of treatment, and then potentially the third line of treatment, but their disease is continuing to progress. They've probably responded on each occasion, but they've come to the end of the recognized treatment pathways for their disease. And one of the benefits of looking at whole genome sequencing or large panel genome sequencing is to identify novel alterations in their disease that could be unique to their tumor, where there may be, and this is known as a druggable target. So there may be already in another cancer type, in another organ system, a recognized therapy for that particular molecular alteration, which is uncommon in their disease, but happens to occur in their particular cancer. And that's now being introduced, and is one of the things that we're exploring at the moment in terms of our portfolio, to looking for unique alterations in patients who've reached the end of their cycles of potential treatment for them.
It's almost like a lifetime of treatment rather than just a point in time, isn't it? Just looking after that patient throughout the entire lifespan.
Yes, it's trying to find extra forms of treatment for them that could potentially work, and there have been some incredible successes in doing that in a number of tumor types.
I think we could just comment as well on potentially the changing sample types, where historically that's always been done on tissue samples, and over more recent years there's been more of a move, or a hope to move, to liquid biopsy samples, and that removes kind of some of the invasive nature of it. And when you are looking at acquired resistance to certain drugs, that can be really useful over time as well.
If I can make a comment about liquid biopsy, that's an area that we're keen to work on. It's emerging at the moment, and we have done some background research on it and working with one of the national experts on that too. But in terms of clinical demand, there isn't that level of clinical demand, but we expect that to happen in the future. And liquid biopsy is essentially, again, this is in cancer care, but could potentially be effective in other areas too. Cancers will shed DNA and RNA into blood, and you can harvest that shed DNA in the blood and look for molecular alterations in that. So it saves the patient having to have further biopsies with time. You just take a simple blood sample and then analyze that blood sample, and it's been shown to be very effective in certain settings. So that's an area which we're very excited about and want to develop going forward.
I guess that's helping the patient as well as the NHS with supporting, sort of not having to send that patient down sort of surgery and things like that. It's not only helping the patient, but we're supporting the NHS even further by doing...
It allows you to monitor somebody's disease without... I mean, you may not even know if a patient gets a recurrent cancer, it may be hidden. You may not be able to see it unless you do very complex imaging technologies. But by taking a simple blood sample, if a known mutation in their disease certainly appears in their blood, then that's an indication that unfortunately their disease has come back. And it's been shown with very early recurrent disease like that, the quicker you treat it, the better the outcome.
So yeah, is there any sort of areas you want to touch upon with like clinical trial support perspective, or?
I think Source BioScience is the best place because it is for a long time, it is NHS provider for biochemical biomarker evaluation. For more than 20 years, I think. And also most of the facilities in Source BioScience lab here is certified is ISO certified and UCAS certified one, and they follow the GCP and all of this regulation one. So the clinical trial actually could here Source BioScience working as a central lab. So because you can see in the NHS now the lab in NHS is very overwhelmed by the workload. So, and also there is established already patient pathway with NHS and Source BioScience. So it will be very easy to send the samples here and the blocks and all of this stuff, and to do the testing here, either biochemical test, genomic test, in a well-controlled environment. And this could be, again, benefit for the clinical trial, to set up a clinical trial with, also here in Nottingham, especially in breast cancer. Nottingham is the most contributor for all of the clinical trials. So for example, Roscoe trial, one of the recent trial here, we almost have 250 patients, while in other centers, the second center to Nottingham, is just to have 60 patients. So again, so if you have a local lab here in Nottingham, could actually support all of this clinical trial work with the expertise, with all of this stuff, with the new technology you are using. So I think this Source BioScience could be a good place for a clinical trial, to set up a clinical trial, and the link. And I think it could fill the gap at the moment between the NHS and the commercial stuff. So this is my...
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. You've mentioned a couple of times there as well how sort of we offer a really quick sort of turnaround time as well. So we've had a number of questions in around our turnaround times for our tests and how these are maintained by our laboratory team. And there's also been a question around business continuity, which is a wider subject but can be linked to this. So would anyone be able to discuss more about that?
Yeah, well, I can certainly talk about the turnaround times from a clinical perspective. We obviously offer a broad range of tests, so I can't talk about them all individually because they have different turnaround times. We can talk about it broadly and maybe give a couple of examples. So effectively, we can monitor our turnaround times in real time. So we have a bespoke LIMS, which means we can kind of interrogate this information on a case-by-case basis, or by test type, or by customer. And that's quite a powerful tool that allows us to monitor these readily. More formally, we generate monthly reports, which means we can then track and trend that data, but also compare it against our KPIs. And that allows us to see how these tests are performing. And if there are any issues, any outliers, we can investigate those through a non-conformance workflow. Thankfully, that doesn't happen very often because our turnaround times are pretty effective. So I can give a couple of examples, perhaps from different test types. So with our HER2 IHC testing, for example, our quoted turnaround time for that is 5 working days, and we deliver, tend to deliver well inside of that. So our average turnaround time in 2022 to date, if you don't include the need for reflex confirmatory FISH testing, is around 3.5 days. And similarly with some of our mutation analysis services, so our KRAS or RAS testing in colorectal cancer, again, our quoted turnaround time is 5 days for that, but we regularly turn those cases around in 2 to 3 days, which we feel is pretty much as competitive as you can get as a referral laboratory. In terms of maintaining those turnaround times, they're realistic in the first place, we feel, and we know we can do it. But we have the advantage of having a relatively small team who process samples effectively end to end, which means you can kind of instill these standards and that ethos of patient-focused care to drive that delivery all the way from sample receipt all the way through to report generation and reporting. So it is a pretty robust and well-monitored system, I think. You mentioned the business continuity and how that's a wider subject, and it is a pretty wide subject, but I guess we can touch upon that a little bit. We certainly have business continuity management policies and plans and procedures in place, and that's to help us maintain these services as best possible. And as a reference laboratory, I guess we're pretty accustomed to adapting to workflows. We don't have control necessarily of how many samples we're going to receive on a day-by-day or week-by-week basis. So we need to be able to adapt to those ebbs and flows anyway. And you know, some of the methods I guess we use to support that is through cross-training of staff. We have good duplication of instrumentation, so that allows for us to cope with breakdowns or surges in work. And likewise, we tend to have very high-level service agreements with our providers to minimize any downtime. We have duplication of methods as well, where that's feasible. So, you know, we can do certain tests on using different assays or different instruments as well. And we have good kind of collaborations with other laboratories within the business. So we have cellular pathology laboratories where, again, there's duplication of staff and instrumentation where that's possible. And we have agreements as well with service providers, so other accredited labs who we can outsource work to if we need to.
Yeah, brilliant. So maybe got time for another couple more. So does Outsource BioScience work with the NHS? What about private healthcare companies?
Yes, both. Source BioScience, right from the start, over 20 years ago, was working with the NHS. Our first clients were NHS hospitals, and we've worked with a huge number, I think over 100 different NHS trusts over the 20-year period. We have large regular clients where we're supporting them continuously every year, other clients who dip in and dip out. So for example, NHS support, everybody thinks pathology laboratories are very big nowadays, but all pathology laboratories are specialized. And so in a specialist team, you may only have 2 pathologists or 3 pathologists. If one becomes ill for whatever reason, or goes away on maternity leave, or takes a sabbatical, that can reduce the team by 50% or 30%, which can impact on their ability to deliver that specialist service to their local clinicians. And so we're often asked to provide a specialist service. It could be lung disease, it could be breast disease, it could be colorectal cancer or skin pathology for a particular trust. So some trusts, we get a broad comprehensive range of work from them, including precision medicine tests. Other trusts, it's very focused on an area of need because they've got a shortfall in pathology cover for that area at the time. And the types of tests we can do are across the board. We're very comprehensive in our ability to provide services around human tissue-based analysis. And we can also support broader activities too. So some trusts, if the pathologist is not able to present their local MDTs for whatever, their multidisciplinary meetings which are involved in cancer care, we can support those too. We have good technology that allows our pathologists to support MDTs in other environments. We've done that on a short-term ad hoc basis. We've also done that on a long-term basis, supporting multidisciplinary meetings in one big teaching hospital trust for over 3 years, for example. We have very good relationships with the private healthcare providers in the UK. Spire, for example, we have a very, very good working relationship and support their pathology laboratories as and when is needed. They also have capacity issues and we can fill in and help them in that environment. So yes, we're agnostic with respect to our clients and both the private and NHS sectors, and also internationally we have services that are available to people too.
Yes, even partnering up with other companies like your Myriads and Oxford Cancer Biomarkers and things like that. So it's almost like strength in numbers from a company perspective as well, offering tests.
We're seen as a very high quality, long established healthcare provider, both to the private sector and the NHS, but also companies coming in with novel assays like Myriad. Myriad have a superb portfolio of genetic and molecular pathology diagnostic tests, which we can offer in the UK. Yep.
So one last question I think we've got time for. So how does Source fit in with the Genomic Hub model, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, the genomic hubs have kind of changed how we interact with some NHS trusts, certainly through that model. But we still receive a lot of testing from trusts across the country relevant to those hubs. And it's still a relatively new system. How they've been set up in the UK, and they're still adapting, I think, to certain situations. And there may be a drive to have greater collaboration and greater outsourcing support for those hubs if they're struggling in the same way that perhaps an individual trust could be struggling. They may need to have those outsourcing requirements there as well. So it's certainly something we'd be willing to continue supporting that testing and supporting those hubs if that was an opportunity that arose.
I can just add a couple of comments. I mean, the genomic hub concept is relatively new, and it's still an evolving structure. It's now established and is here to stay, but those hubs have capacity issues. They are supporting very, very substantive parts of the country. So there are very few genomic hubs in the UK, and they're providing all of the genomic tests, both for inherited genetic disease and cancer type testing, or molecular biology type testing. Their portfolio is comprehensive, but they are struggling to deliver in a timely fashion. So in terms of standard genetic testings of inherited disease, the timescales are maybe the turnaround times are probably less sensitive, but in terms of cancer treatment, where patients have pathways with time delivery standards attached to those, timeliness of provision of molecular diagnostic tests is absolutely critical. And so there are currently, and there will remain, in my view, still problems of timeliness of that. And so we're having a dialogue with the genome hubs and also with clients of the genome hubs and around how we can support them in ensuring they maintain their services and helping them provide a timely service for their patients.
Do you think there's almost been like a bit of a stigma that they can't sort of outsource, where like work almost has to stay within the hubs? Do you think that's almost sort of
yes, there's always been a culture in the NHS, and perhaps in most of the genomic hubs have come from the genetics side of testing rather than the pathology and molecular pathology side of testing. So there is a degree of different cultures in there. But the NHS has always had a culture of wanting to do things internally. Every surgeon says, I want my laboratory to do this test. But over the last 20 years, what we've seen is that there's an increasing understanding that for certainly particularly difficult tests, or tests where you're only doing a small number, if you were doing that test in your own laboratory, you're doing a handful a year. There are issues of reliability of those if you're not maintaining that expertise. And that's been shown in a number of publications from the US, from this country, around what is the minimum volume of a particular test you should do to maintain your proficiency in providing that test. And so for some of these rarer tests, it's logical to outsource those to providers like ourselves, which we've been doing for 20 years, or to within the larger hubs within the NHS structure.
Yeah, it gives them time to sort of focus on other things as well, yeah.
What about you provide service for UK? What about the rest of the world? Do you have any branches outside UK? Do you plan to have virtual or people from other countries to send here samples for you and to do some of the genomic test or of your service?
The simple answer to that, Tarek, is yes. We're with obviously things have been unusual in the last few years with COVID and the change of things. The NHS is still recovering from that, and I have to say we have had significant amount of work with the NHS. Many trusts are struggling to cope. So we do have, to a degree, a capacity issue, but we are very keen. Our strategic plan is to work and to broaden our horizons. we have dipped our toes many years ago into the Middle East market, and we would still like to do that. And also we're exploring other parts of Europe. So yes, you're right. It's an obvious thing for us to do, is to go from being a very UK-centric company to be an international company, and we have those strong ambitions.
We've also got digital pathology as well, which almost sort of helps reduce that gap, sort of helping support sort of globally as well eventually.
Yes, I mean we've converted to digital. We've acquired a company called LD Pathology, who have long-standing expertise in digital pathology, and we're transitioning over very rapidly to using digital pathology as our routine service model. That does allow us to work easily with pathologists elsewhere in the world who are appropriately accredited and trained and experienced to work for our NHS clients. But it does, and this still remains a capacity issue with pathologists, even for companies like us. We still, because of the workload is constantly increasing, and so we do want to expand our pool of pathologists. So any pathologists out there interested, please knock on our door.
Lovely. So I think that ties it up nicely. So thanks again for joining us here today and answering all our questions. But obviously, if there is any questions that you've submitted and we haven't had time to sort of answer them, then feel free to email us and we can get back to you with those answers. So I'd like to say thanks again and thank you for tuning in. Thank you.